we stayed with that family, as I said, about at least a week. And I have no idea now what their name was, and probably couldn't pronounce it anyway, but they were real nice people. And whenever we left Ghent, we got into, I forget what they were called, maybe a buffalo, I don't remember now. But it was a big tracked vehicle with no gun or anything like that. It had a machine gun on it, but no other guns or anything inside of it. It was just a big metal box, really, with tracks on it that was seaworthy. And we got into those things and left Ghent and went up along the coast. We weren't very far out. I doubt if we were ever much over a mile from the shore. And the channel was just full of those things going up to the Scheldt estuary in Holland, where the river Scheldt came out, and they had told us that probably we wouldn't have anything much to worry about to capture that part. They wanted to get that Scheldt River and canal till they could capture the town of Antwerp. The canal went around and they needed a big port to unload supplies. And they said that as far as the intelligence had been able to find out, the Germans didn't have much heavy artillery or anything like that, too many tanks, or it's mostly just second-rate troops, and about the heaviest weapons they had were mortars and machine guns. And we went up, as I say, up the channel, and when we got close to Holland, the islands, they were Dutch islands, Holstein Islands, the Frisian Islands, and Breskens, and some of that outfit. The Germans did have big guns on them, and they started shooting at us. They didn't do a whole lot of damage, but scared the hell out of us. And some way somebody didn't, or we had been delayed. I don't remember now just exactly what they did say the official reason was. But we didn't get to Holland at the right time, and there wasn't enough water. Water wasn't deep enough to float those vehicles, and was too deep for them to get down to get a good, the track could get a hold of the sand, and we were hung up out there. We couldn't move. We wasn't deep enough to float, or shallow enough till the tracks. They had tracks on them, and that's what pulled them through the water, was those tracks, like a side paddle wheel boat. And I don't remember how long we were there. It seemed like we was there for hours, but I know it wasn't. Till the tide went back out, till the tracks would get a bite of the sand, and we could go into a dike. There was a big dike alongside of the ocean there that was, I don't know, I'd say it was 30 to 40 feet high. And when we got on that, the water was just right up to the bottom of the dike, you might say, and we just, on the edge of the dike was the only dry ground we had. And they was shooting at us with those big guns from the Flushing Islands there. And there was a shell hit close to me. I mean, not right at me, but fairly close. And I felt something hit me in the back, in the lower back, just where my hip bones are, about that area anyway, and just laid me flat, and I was paralyzed from that place on down. I couldn't move my legs or anything, and the only thing I could think of was that a piece of shrapnel had hit me in the spine, and it hit hard enough that I wasn't in any pain, but I just couldn't move, and I got wiggled around some way till I could get my hand back there, and I figured that I'd find a hole there I could put my fist in, but all it was a big ball of mud. Not as big as a softball, but bigger than a baseball, was stuck onto my leather jerkin. And after a while I took that ball of mud off, found out what it was, and took it off of there, and after, I don't know, 3/4 of an hour or maybe an hour, I don't know, the feeling came back in my legs. I wasn't hurt or anything. I'd been scared to death, but whenever I found that ball of mud, I knew there wasn't any hole in me. But we were there. In fact, I think we set up the mortars and provided some fire for the rifle companies that were going forward. But we never got over that dike for, I don't know, 2 or 3 days before we could get on the other side of that dike. But we'd crawl up on top of to the edge of the dike and peer over the top of it. And there was battleships out in the channel out there firing to help the advancing rifle companies. And I remember one time I was looking over the dike, maybe 1/4 of a mile to 1/2 a mile. The country on the other side of that dike was just as flat as a table, and I could see a bunch of troops coming down the road, double time running really. And I thought I could see that they had gray uniforms on. They were German prisoners. And a machine gun opened up on them and just cut down a lot of them, and a lot of them got down and off the side of the road and so forth. And I could tell that the machine gun that was firing at him, by the sound of it and how close together the tracer bullets were, that it was a German machine gun, because they shot so much faster than the Canadian machine guns. And someplace German soldiers, officers or something could see those guys surrendered, or had surrendered, and they were machine gunning their own men, and they were too far away for me to do anything about it. I couldn't see where the machine gun was firing from, and it was so far away that I couldn't have done anything with my rifle. I had my rifle up there on the dike with me. I weren't using them anyway, weren't having a mortar fire because I was up on the dike. If they'd have been using the mortar, I'd have been down with the mortar. But the intelligence was wrong. They had not any big artillery weapons. They had some 88 millimeter jobs, anti-aircraft guns that they used for anti-tank guns and artillery too. But the Highland Light Infantry didn't run into too much opposition. A lot of the other outfits got shot up bad, suffered a lot of casualties, but we got inland finally. It got over the dike and inland to peace, and sometime not too long after that, after we got inland a few miles, I don't know how far now, distance, I didn't worry about how much distance it was just so I wasn't up against the Germans, but we were in a barn, the mortar section, the whole mortar platoon. The rifle companies were out ahead someplace, and we were back 500 to 1,000 yards. And we heard a big explosion, and water finally started coming in, and came into that barn where we were, and we got orders to get out of there. Don't bother trying to take any equipment or anything. Take your rifle and your what clothing you have on. Of course, we slept in our clothes all the time anyway. And get out of there. And by the time we got out of there, we were wading water knee deep or more. The Germans had blown the dike and just flooded us out like rats. And but we did get out of there and got someplace to a little higher ground or behind another dike. I don't remember now exactly what, but anyway, we got away. And then the next day, or maybe 2 days, we went back to that place. Of course, her sleeping bag, bedroll, and everything like that were soaked, but the vehicles hadn't been damaged. The water didn't actually get deep enough to hurt them, and we got our equipment back, tracked equipment and motorized vehicle, trucks and so forth, and went someplace where there wasn't water anyhow. But Holland is so flat that part of Holland, that a lot of it is actually below sea level, but it's protected by dikes and floodgates and pretty complicated thing there. And sometime not too long after that, I don't remember just how long, possibly it was up into the 1st of November, probably was. I was climbing up into a barn loft. They had a concrete drive through the center of the barn. It was concrete floor there, and a ladder that went into the loft on each side of this driveway had a ladder up. It was just a straight up and down, just a vertical ladder, wasn't a stairway. And my feet was muddy and wet and slick, and I was climbing up to get into that loft to sleep and slipped off that ladder and fell about 10 or 12 feet, I guess, and lit right on my left foot on that concrete and broke my left foot. And that was in the night sometime. I don't remember what time now, but I put up with it until the next afternoon, and it was so painful that I couldn't stand it anymore, and I went to the medical officer, and he was going to send me to the hospital, and he was convinced that the foot was broken. It wasn't, it was just a crack in the arch. I just hit hard enough on the floor that it broke the arch bone in my foot. And they took me to the town of Bruges, Belgium, where the big military hospital, British and Canadian hospital was, and put me in the hospital. I was there for a month. They never put my foot in a cast. They wrapped it in elastic tape and just wrapped layer after layer of it, and it hurt me worse than the foot did. But my bed was right between a French Canadian named Leo Cote, C-O-T-E, that could not, he had joined the Army in 1939, and he never spoke any English until after he got into the Army. He was in the reconnaissance platoon, 17th Duke of York Hussars, and on the other side of my bed was a little Scotchman from the 51st Highland Division. I don't remember what his first name was, but his last name was Gilly. And he spoke with such a Scotch accent that I couldn't understand either one of them, really. And they would get into the damnedest arguments. Why didn't the other one speak English? They, I suppose if they could have got out of bed, Cody had fallen through a plate glass window when he was drunk, had fallen through a plate glass window and cut his arm, forearm, and wrist real bad. And his fingers didn't work right. When his arm was stretched out, his hand was open, but if he pulled it up, his fingers closed up. And they were waiting till they had the right doctor, I don't know what, and they were going to operate on him and try to repair those tendons till he could move his arm, flex his elbow to get it up without clenching his fist. And he was absolutely against that. He said that so many times he'd get drunk and he'd reach out on the bar for a bottle of beer and he'd drop it before he got it back to his house. And he says, if I leave my arm alone, says I'll just grip it tighter every time I take it toward my mouth. Says I can't drop my beer. And he was absolutely against fixing that arm. He was willing to live with it the rest of his life. And it just so happened that all the British troops, there were British troops about probably almost half as many in the hospital as there were Canadian troops. And if the the Canadian troops had been shot or hit with shrapnel or whatever, it was in the front of them. And I mean, there was nothing to what we tried to make of it, but the British troops had all been hit in the back. And we, of course, accused them all of being running away from the enemies. The reason they were shot in the back or hit in the back with shrapnel, that they were running away from the enemy, and there was no truth whatsoever in it, but that's the way it was. And this Leo Cody had two brothers in the Canadian Army, and one brother, it was his right arm that was messed up, and he was right-handed, and he asked if I would write a letter to his brother that was in the same regiment as he was. And I said, yeah, I'll write it. Said, you'll have to tell me what to write and how to spell it and so forth. And he said he doesn't read English, and Cody himself didn't read English, but he said, I'll tell you as well as I can in English, and you can write it in French. And I never had such a hell of a time of trying to get anything done. French-Canadian soldiers that could barely speak English, telling a Brown County boy in broken English how to write a letter in French. And the French, if you've ever seen any French writing, they've got little punctuation marks, but along top of the letters and to the side of them. I have no idea what they mean, but he would tell me to what where to put one by what letter. They did have the same letters, but I don't recall what his brother's name was, but his nickname, and he called him by that name, and I wrote the letter to that name, was a French word that meant thumb. Now why his name was that, I have no idea. He never told me, and I probably couldn't have understood it if he had. But it took me half a day to write a little 1.5 or 2 page letter, trying to write it in French, and him telling me how to do it. But when I got it done, he read it, and he said, that's all right, that's very good. And there was another fellow there that he was in the Dutch resistance outfit, and the artillery, the range of an artillery shell depends on how many little bags of powder you put behind the shell. And if they're shooting fairly close, they don't use their, I believe each shell had 7 little bags of powder, propellant, whatever it was. It wasn't powder, it was gunite or something. I don't remember what the name of it was now. But anyway, if they were shooting fairly close, they used so many of them, and the others were just thrown away, thrown in a pile, and then after the shoot was over with, they were just burned, because after they had been unwrapped or taken out of the box, and in maybe rain or whatever, why they couldn't be depended on to be the right strength. So they just pitch them out in a pile and then burn them. And this Dutch guy had been gathering up the powder, the bags, getting them gathered up from where they'd just been thrown out, hadn't been thrown out in a very neat pile. And he was gathering them up and putting them in a neater pile to be burned. And somebody didn't see what he was doing, or I don't remember. He told us he spoke good English. In fact, he said he spoke 4 or 5 different languages. He was a very well-educated man. And that powder went up and just burned him terribly. He was wrapped up in both his hands and arms were big thick bandages, and his whole head was wrapped up. He just had a hole cut for his mouth and 2 for his eyes. And I think maybe there was a couple little holes, or maybe 1 hole for his nose. But, and I believe every hour, not any greater time than that, the nurse would come by with a little, like a clothes sprinkler to iron clothing with or something, and wet all those bandages with some kind of fluid. I suppose it was water, germ-free water anyway, and probably some antibiotics or something, maybe penicillin. Penicillin was being used. Anyway, they'd spray that. They didn't want it to ever dry up any, and they'd spray him down with that. And he was, at that time, you could smoke all you wanted to in the hospital. They issue you cigarettes, and you could lay in your bed and smoke, and a lot of people did because they didn't have anything else to do. And he was just in misery because he couldn't smoke, and he asked Cody and I if we could fix him a cigarette holder of some kind that he could smoke, and that would reach through his bandages. And we got some stiff black paper and rolled it around a cigarette and made it maybe 5 or 6 inches long, that somebody could hold. He couldn't hold it because his hands was just wrapped up in a big, almost big as a boxing glove. And we could put a cigarette in it and stick the end of it in his mouth and hold it there and light the cigarette, and he could puff on it. And he was just so happy that he could smoke. And we had fixed him something that anything that would have been in his power to do for us, he would have done. And there was a Red Cross girl in the hospital there that her family owned the biggest chain of jewelry stores in Canada. And she showed us pictures of her family's estate, and they had private lakes on that estate that was bigger than Lake Lemon. And she, because there's 1 Canadian and 1 American, she kind of adopted us. And she told me afterwards that after 3 or 4 days, said the first few days, said she didn't, she'd come to the bed asking if I wanted cigarettes or candy or a book to read or what, and said I was so mad from falling out of a barn and being a farm boy and climbing into barn lofts all my life, that said nobody could get close to me. I'd just cuss and rant and rare because I was so stupid to let myself fall out of a barn. But when I got a little better, she'd come and sit on her bed and talk to us. And she got flu of some kind, and she was confined to a bed in the hospital, but she sent for us to come visit her, Leo, Cody, and I, and since both of us I could hobble along with crutches, and he could walk all right, and we'd go to her room, and since she was well off, she was supplied with the very best Canadian whiskey and cigarettes and everything else, and she'd send for us after supper to come visit her, and we'd go there to her room and talk with her and laugh and carry on and drink and smoke and a lot of times we wasn't much more than able to get back to our own beds when we'd leave her room. Her first name was Sheila, but I can't remember her last name. I think Burks, but I don't know whether that's right or not. But after I left that hospital, I went back to Ghent, Belgium, and I didn't find anybody that spoke good French till I could visit that family that I had been billeted with. But there was a fella in the same barracks room that I was in, and his name was Snyder, and he had a Highland Light Infantry officer's necktie, and we were all convalescent soldiers, really didn't have anything special to do. But we were in a barracks compound and had a gate there that you had to have a paper to get out of and get back in. And this Snyder, he was just a private like myself, but he'd get a bunch of us. There were several Highland Light Infantry guys there, and then other people too. And he'd get a bunch of us together, like a squad or a small platoon or whatever, and he'd get in front and bark out a bunch of orders and get us all lined up and so forth. And since he had an overcoat on, it was in the winter time in December, and all that was showing to him, what was showed his rank or anything, was that officer's necktie. And he'd march out at the head of us and call out time and everything else, and we'd march up to the gate, and the guards on the gate would salute him, and he'd return their salute, and we'd walk right on out the gate up into town and go to wherever, movie or restaurant or bar generally, and just aimed to go back in time for lunch, and we'd be all agreed to meet at a certain place, and he'd get in front of us again and march right back through the gate and be saluted and return the salute, and we'd go on in and back to our barracks room there for lunch. And one day when we'd been up in town there. We started back and my foot got hurting so bad that I couldn't keep up with the rest of the outfit. And I was way behind, and I was in one block and they were going into the gate kind of around the corner in another block. But I hobbled on up to the gate and told the guard that I was limping, probably exaggerating my limp just a little bit, and said that I had to fall out of that platoon. I couldn't keep up with them. I had to fall out, and that's the right reason I was by myself instead of in a group, and he just passed me right on in, and which I figured he probably would, but he wouldn't have had to by any means. But and at night we just shoot craps and play poker, and that's the only time in my life that I ever won at poker or craps. I come out of there way ahead of what when I went into that replacement barracks.